The coffee cup slipped from Coraline's trembling hands, shattering against the trailer's linoleum floor as she stared at the hospital bill. $47,832.16. The numbers blurred through her tears, each digit a dagger to her already bleeding hope. "Tia Cora," 6-year-old Sophie's voice cut through the silence, her small frame appearing in the doorway wearing mismatched pajamas, and concern far too heavy for her age. "Why are you crying?" Coraline quickly wiped her face, forcing a smile that felt like broken glass. "Just tired, sweetheart, go back to bed." But Sophie's eyes, those devastating green eyes that mirrored Coraline's own, caught the paper before her aunt could hide it. "Is that about Mama Emma?" The question hung in the air like smoke from their broken heater. Emma, Coraline's twin sister, lay in Cedar Falls General fighting for her life while insurance companies played God with co-pays and coverage limits. The experimental treatment that could save her cost more than Coraline would make in 5 years slinging coffee at Mel's Diner. Her phone buzzed. Another text from the hospital billing department. Another reminder that Hope had a price tag she couldn't afford. Coraline's hands shook as she opened her laptop, an ancient Dell held together with duct tape and prayers. The job search sites mocked her with their requirements. College degree preferred, experience required, references needed. She had calloused hands, a high school diploma, and 3 hours of sleep per night. The cursor blinked on Craigslist's gigs section when she saw it. A posting so absurd she almost laughed. Seeking temporary fiancé for business arrangement. 1-week commitment. Discretion essential. Compensation, $75,000. Her finger hovered over the mouse. $75,000. More money than she'd ever seen in one place. Enough to save Emma. Enough to give Sophie the childhood she deserved instead of nights spent coloring quietly while Mama fought for her life. Scam, she whispered to herself. But desperation made people do crazy things. She clicked. The email that came back 2 hours later was professional, cold, and terrifyingly real. An address on 5th Avenue in Manhattan. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. Bring valid ID. Coraline stared at her reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. Her Converse sneakers had a hole near the toe. Her jeans were clean but faded. Her shirt, her best shirt, still smelled faintly of bacon grease no matter how many times she washed it. But her eyes held something that hadn't been there in months, a flicker of possibility. She thought of Emma's smile this morning, weak but determined. "Promise me something," Emma had whispered, gripping Coraline's hand with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll take a chance on something wild. Life's too short to play it safe." At the time, Coraline had assumed Emma meant adding extra whipped cream to her coffee. Now, staring at that email, she realized Emma might have meant something far more dangerous. The elevator in the Devereaux Holdings building was larger than Coraline's entire living room. Its mirrors reflected her nervous energy back from every angle as she rode to the 47th floor, clutching a resume she'd printed at the library, and a hope that felt increasingly foolish with each passing floor. The receptionist, all sharp angles and designer clothes, looked at Coraline like she'd tracked mud through a cathedral. "Mr. Devereaux will see you now." The office doors opened to reveal a space that belonged in movies, not real life. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Central Park. The desk was mahogany and larger than her trailer's kitchen table, and behind it sat the most intimidating man she'd ever seen. Lachlan Alexander Devereaux was exactly what she'd expected and nothing like she'd prepared for. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that probably cost more to maintain than her monthly rent. His suit looked like it had been sewn directly onto his body by angels with impeccable taste. But it was his eyes, steel blue and calculating, that made her want to run. "Miss Ellis." His voice was whiskey and winter nights. "Please sit." She perched on the edge of the leather chair, feeling like a sparrow in a cage full of hawks. "Mr. Devereaux, I have to ask, is this legitimate? Because if this is some kind of $75,000. He slid a contract across the desk. 1 week, 7 days of public appearances as my fiancé. No physical intimacy, separate accommodations. A simple business transaction. Her hands trembled as she picked up the document. The numbers were real. The letterhead was real. The man across from her was definitely real, though he seemed carved from marble rather than born from flesh. Why me? The question escaped before she could stop it. Something flickered in his expression. So brief she almost missed it. "You're not in my social circle. No prior connections to complicate matters. And," he paused, studying her with uncomfortable intensity, "you need the money." Heat flooded her cheeks. Of course he'd done his research. Probably knew about Emma, about Sophie, about every unpaid bill and broken dream. There's a merger, he continued, his tone businesslike again. Harrington and Associates. They value traditional family structures. A fiancé demonstrates stability, commitment, the kind of man they want to do business with. So I'm a prop. You're a solution to a problem. He leaned back in his chair. As I am to yours. Coraline thought of Emma's pale face this morning, of Sophie asking why they couldn't afford the good cereal anymore, of the eviction notice hidden under her mattress. What exactly would I have to do? Smile, hold my hand, attend dinners, convince a room full of investors that I'm capable of human emotion. The last part came out bitter, like he was revealing more than he intended. She studied his face, sharp cheekbones, a small scar through his left eyebrow, lips that looked like they'd forgotten how to smile. There was something lonely about him, something that reminded her of Sophie when she thought no one was watching. And after the week, you disappear. I get my merger, you get your money. We never see each other again. The contract felt heavy in her hands. $75,000. Emma's life, Sophie's future, her own chance at something more than minimum wage and borrowed time. I need to think about it. You have until tomorrow. He stood, towering over her. The first event is tomorrow night. Decide quickly, Miss Ellis. Time is a luxury neither of us can afford. Coraline stared at the contract spread across her tiny kitchen table like a map to salvation. The pages rustled in the draft from their broken window, the one they couldn't afford to fix, just like everything else that had fallen apart in the past year. You're actually considering this? Ruby Santos stood in the doorway, her chef's apron still dusted with flour from the diner's evening rush. As Coraline's best friend and the closest thing to a mother figure she had, Ruby's disapproval radiated like heat from a stove. $75,000, Ruby. Coraline's voice cracked on the amount. That's Emma's treatment, Sophie's college fund, a real life instead of this. She gestured around their cramped trailer, where the walls were so thin you could hear Mrs. Henderson's television 3 units down. And what happens to your soul in the process? Ruby pulled out the rickety chair across from her, her dark eyes serious. Rich men don't offer that kind of money without wanting something in return. Something that contract probably doesn't mention. Before Coraline could respond, Sophie burst through the door, her backpack dragging behind her like a defeated flag. Tia Cora, Mrs. Peterson says I need new shoes for gym class, but I told her these are still good. She lifted her foot, revealing a sole held on with duct tape and determination. The sight hit Coraline like a physical blow. 6 years old, and Sophie was already learning to make excuses for their poverty. Already understanding that wanting things was a luxury they couldn't afford. We'll figure it out, baby, Coraline whispered, pulling Sophie into a hug that smelled like strawberry shampoo and childhood innocence. Is that why you were crying last night? Sophie's voice was muffled against Coraline's shoulder. Because of money? Ruby's expression softened, but her jaw remained set. There has to be another way. What way? Coraline's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. I've applied to every job in 3 counties. Emma's getting sicker. The bills keep coming, and that man... She stopped, remembering the loneliness she'd glimpsed behind LACHLAN's cold facade. Maybe we'd be helping each other, or maybe you'd be walking into a trap. Sophie pulled back, her green eyes wide with the kind of wisdom that children shouldn't possess. What if it's magic, like in the stories? What if the scary prince is really just sad inside, out of the mouths of babes? Coraline thought of LACHLAN's careful composure, the way his fingers had drummed against his desk when he thought she wasn't looking, the bitter edge to his voice when he'd mentioned convincing people he was capable of human emotion. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. First event is the Harrington Charity Gala tomorrow at 8 p.m. Decision needed by noon. LD. Even his texts were commanding. Ruby followed her gaze to the phone. You're going to do it, aren't you? Coraline looked at Sophie's shoes, held together by hope and adhesive, at the eviction notice she'd hidden under the sugar jar, at the photo of Emma on their mantel taken before chemo stole her hair and the light from her eyes. I have to. The words felt like stepping off a cliff. For them. For all of us. Ruby shook her head but reached across the table to squeeze Coraline's hand. Then I guess we'd better figure out how to make you look like you belong in his world. As if she could ever belong anywhere but here, in this broken-down trailer with its leaky roof and love-filled walls. But for $75,000, she'd learn to pretend. The emerald gown hung in Coraline's hands like liquid starlight. its price tag still attached, $8,500, more than she'd made in 6 months. The stylist, a sharp-featured woman named Vivian, circled her like a predator evaluating prey. "Darling, we have work to do." Vivian's voice carried the kind of authority that came from transforming ordinary women into magazine covers. Mr. Devereaux was very specific about the image we're creating. The hotel suite where this transformation was taking place could have housed 3 families. Coraline stood in front of mirrors that reflected her inadequacies from every angle. Chipped nail polish, split ends, the small scar on her chin from when she'd fallen off her bike at 8. "I don't think I can do this," she whispered, overwhelmed by the army of beauty tools laid out like surgical instruments. "Nonsense." Vivian's tone brooked no argument. "Beauty is simply confidence in expensive packaging. And darling, Mr. Devereaux has provided very expensive packaging indeed." 3 hours later, Coraline stared at a stranger in the mirror. The woman looking back had smoky eyes that seemed to hold secrets, lips the color of wine, and hair that fell in waves down her back. The dress hugged curves she'd forgotten she had, transforming her from a tired waitress into something that belonged in fairy tales. "Perfect." Vivian stepped back with satisfaction. "Now remember, spine straight, chin up, and never, ever let them see you sweat." A knock at the door made Coraline's heart hammer against her ribs. She opened it to find LACHLAN in a tuxedo that probably cost more than her car. He looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine, all sharp lines and masculine elegance. But when his eyes met hers, something flickered across his face that looked almost like surprise. "You clean up well, Miss Ellis." His voice was carefully neutral, but she caught the slight roughness at the edges. "Thank you. I think..." She smoothed the dress nervously. "Should we go over our story again? How we met, how long we've been together?" "Coffee shop," he said, offering his arm. 6 months ago, you spilled coffee on my laptop. I asked you to dinner to make up for ruining your apron." The lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly that for a moment she almost believed it herself. "And we've been inseparable ever since." Something like that. They walked to the elevator in silence, but she could feel him watching her. When the doors closed, trapping them in the small space together, she caught a hint of his cologne, something expensive and masculine that made her think of midnight and secrets. "Are you nervous?" The question escaped before she could stop it. He turned to look at her, really look at her, and for a moment his mask slipped. "Terrified," he admitted quietly, "but not for the reasons you'd expect." The elevator dinged, announcing their arrival at the lobby. The doors opened to reveal a world of marble and crystal, of people who belonged to a universe she'd only seen in movies. As they stepped into the crowd, LACHLAN's hand settled on the small of her back. Warm, steady, unexpectedly comforting. "Showtime," he murmured near her ear, his breath sending shivers down her spine. But as they walked toward the waiting car, Coraline couldn't shake the feeling that this performance might be more dangerous than either of them realized. Because somewhere between the hotel suite and the lobby, something had shifted, and she was no longer sure who was pretending and who was falling. The Harrington Charity Gala was a constellation of Manhattan's elite, each guest more polished than the last. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors, where conversations worth billions unfolded behind champagne flutes and practiced smiles. Coraline's hand trembled slightly on LACHLAN's arm as they entered the ballroom. Every eye seemed to appraise her, weighing her worth against their expectations. She felt like a fraud wrapped in silk and diamonds. "Breathe," LACHLAN murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You belong here as much as anyone else." Before she could respond, a woman approached, silver-haired, regal, with eyes that missed nothing. Victoria Harrington herself, the queen of this particular kingdom. "LACHLAN, darling." Victoria's smile was sharp as a blade. "And this must be the mysterious fiancé we've heard whispers about." "Victoria, may I present Coraline Ellis?" LACHLAN's hand pressed gently against Coraline's back. "Coraline, Victoria Harrington." Enchanted, Victoria's gaze swept over Coraline like a scanner searching for flaws. "Tell me, dear, what is it you do?" The question hung in the air like a trap. Coraline felt the weight of her fabricated backstory, the lies they'd rehearsed about her being a consultant for nonprofit organizations. But looking into Victoria's intelligent eyes, she made a choice that surprised even herself. "I'm a waitress." The words came out steady, honest. "At a diner in Vermont. I serve coffee and pie to people who work hard for their money." Silence rippled around them. LACHLAN's hand stiffened against her back, but he didn't pull away. Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly. but her expression remained unreadable. How refreshingly honest. Victoria's smile became genuine for the first time. In a room full of people who've forgotten what real work looks like, that's quite remarkable. The conversation flowed after that, but Coraline barely heard it. She was too aware of LACHLAN beside her, the way his jaw had tightened when she'd deviated from their script, the protective way he'd shifted closer when other guests stared too long. During dinner, seated at a table that cost more than her monthly salary, she watched him navigate conversations about market projections and international trade with the ease of someone born to this world. But she also noticed the way his fingers drummed against his thigh when he thought no one was looking, the careful distance he maintained from everyone except her. "You surprised me tonight," he said during a quiet moment between courses. "Bad surprised or good surprised? I'm still deciding." His eyes met hers, and she saw something there that made her pulse quicken. "You could have cost us everything with that honesty. Would you have preferred I lied? I expected you to lie." He paused, considering. But Victoria responded well to the truth. "Perhaps I underestimated both of you." The orchestra began playing, and couples drifted toward the dance floor. LACHLAN stood and offered his hand. "Shall we?" His palm was warm against hers as he led her into a waltz she'd only seen in movies. For someone who claimed to be emotionally frozen, he moved with surprising grace, guiding her through steps she'd never learned. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Devereaux." She found herself closer to him than their contract specified, close enough to see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes. "So are you, Miss Ellis." His voice was rough velvet. "The question is, are we both prepared for what comes next?" As if summoned by his words, a man approached their table during a break in the music. Tall, predatory smile, eyes like a shark. James Morrison. LACHLAN. The name dripped with false warmth. "What an interesting development. I had no idea you were capable of such domesticity." James Morrison's presence poisoned the air around them like smoke from a toxic fire. Coraline felt LACHLAN's entire body tense beside her, his hand tightening protectively on her waist. "James." LACHLAN's voice could have frozen champagne. "Still crashing parties you weren't invited to, I see." "Oh, but I was invited." Morrison's smile was all teeth and malice. "Victoria and I go way back. In fact, I was just telling her about some fascinating research I've been conducting on your romantic history." Coraline's blood turned to ice water. Beside her, she could feel LACHLAN calculating, planning, the way she imagined generals did before battles they weren't sure they could win. "Research?" Victoria Harrington materialized beside them, her expression curious but wary. "How intriguing." "Yes. Well, when I heard about LACHLAN's sudden engagement, I couldn't help but wonder about the timeline." Morrison pulled out his phone with theatrical flair. "You see, I have receipts from a certain diner in Vermont. Mel's Diner, to be precise, showing our dear LACHLAN visited there quite regularly, for months, before this whirlwind romance supposedly began." The words hit Coraline like physical blows. He'd been watching her, for months. Every tired smile, every spilled coffee, every moment she'd thought she was invisible. He'd been there studying her like a specimen. "How romantic," Victoria murmured, but her eyes had sharpened. "A man who courts from afar. Or," Morrison continued, "a man who needed a convincing actress for a very expensive performance." "That's enough." LACHLAN stepped forward, his voice deadly quiet. "You've made your point, James. Now walk away." "Have I made my point?" Morrison turned to Coraline, his gaze predatory. "Tell me, Miss Ellis, what do you know about LACHLAN's last relationship? About Catherine Winters?" The name landed like a bomb in the conversation. Coraline saw something crack in LACHLAN's expression, pain so raw it made her chest ache. "Catherine died," LACHLAN said, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 years ago. Car accident. Convenient," Morrison said. "Just like this engagement. Just like everything in your perfectly controlled life." That's when Coraline snapped. All the fear, all the insecurity, all the months of watching Emma waste away while rich people played games with money that could save lives. It all crystallized into fury. "You know what I know about LACHLAN?" She stepped forward, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet area of the ballroom. "I know he tips waitresses 50% because he understands what it's like to struggle. I know he visits his parents' graves every Saturday because family matters to him. I know he pretends to be made of ice because caring too much almost killed him once." She turned to Morrison, her green eyes blazing. "And I know that whatever twisted game you're playing, you've already lost. Because while you've been digging through trash looking for secrets, he's been building something real." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria watched the exchange with fascination, while other guests pretended not to eavesdrop while hanging on every word. Morrison's smile faltered. Very touching, but receipts don't lie, sweetheart. Neither do I. Coraline's voice was steady as steel. And the receipt that matters most is the one showing a man who chose love over convenience. Something you clearly wouldn't understand. She took Lachlan's hand, feeling it shake slightly in hers. Now, if you'll excuse us, my fiancé and I have a life to build. As they walked away, she heard Victoria's voice behind them. James, I think this conversation is over. But Coraline knew the real conversation. The one between her heart and his was just beginning. The hotel room felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Coraline paced the marble floor in her bare feet, the emerald gown pooling around her ankles like liquid starlight, while Lachlan stood frozen by the window overlooking Central Park. You were watching me. Her voice cracked on the words. For months. Every terrible day, every moment I thought I was invisible. You were there. Yes. The admission came out raw, scraped from somewhere deep inside him. Why? She spun to face him, her carefully styled hair coming undone, makeup smudged from unshed tears. Why didn't you just approach me? Why this elaborate charade? Lachlan turned from the window, and for the first time since she'd met him, his armor was completely gone. His bow tie hung loose around his neck, his perfect hair disheveled from running his hands through it. He looked young, vulnerable, utterly human. Because I'm a coward. The words seemed to surprise him as much as they did her. Because the last time I let myself care about someone, she died because of me. Catherine. Catherine. He closed his eyes as if the name caused physical pain. She was driving to meet me. A dinner I insisted on. A fight we were having about my inability to let anyone close. She ran a red light because she was crying, because I'd made her cry, and his voice broke. Coraline watched this powerful man crumble, and every instinct she had screamed at her to go to him. It wasn't your fault, wasn't it? His laugh was bitter. I have this effect on people, Coraline. I destroy everything I touch. Catherine knew it. My parents knew it before they died, and you? He looked at her with something that might have been regret. You defended me tonight like I was worth saving. You are worth saving. The words escaped before she could stop them, honest and devastating. Am I? Or am I just another rich man buying affection I don't deserve? Coraline's phone buzzed from the dresser. A text from Ruby. Emma's in the hospital. Emergency. Come now. The world tilted sideways. She stared at the message, feeling everything. The dress, the charade, the growing feelings she'd been trying to deny. Collapse around her like a house of cards. I have to go. She was already moving, searching for her shoes, her purse, her keys. Emma, my sister, I'll drive you. Lachlan was already reaching for his jacket. No. The word came out harsher than she intended. This isn't part of our contract. You don't owe me anything beyond tomorrow. Damn the contract. His voice was fierce, urgent. You think I care about a piece of paper right now? She stopped moving, shoes in one hand, purse in the other, and stared at him. The man who'd claimed he was made of ice, who'd built walls around his heart higher than skyscrapers, was looking at her like she was his entire world. I can't do this, she whispered. I can't pretend anymore. Not with Emma dying. Not with you looking at me like I'm falling in love with you. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither of them knew how to cross. Are you? Terrifyingly, completely, catastrophically in love with you. He stepped closer, his voice breaking on every word. And I know I have no right to feel this way about someone I hired. Someone who deserves so much better than a broken man who ruins everything he touches. Her heart shattered and soared simultaneously. Lachlan, go. He pressed his car keys into her palm, his fingers lingering against her skin. Go to your sister. Fight for her the way you fought for me tonight. And when this is over, when you've saved her, decide if a man like me is worth the risk. As she ran toward the door, she heard him whisper, because I already know you're worth everything. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of Sophie's Dreams Bakery and Cafe, illuminating flour-dusted surfaces and the scent of fresh cinnamon rolls. Coraline wiped her hands on her apron, no longer stained with grease from Mel's diner, but dusted with the dreams she'd finally dared to pursue. Emma sat at a corner table, her hair grown back in copper curls, typing on her laptop. The experimental treatment had worked, funded by an anonymous donor who'd left instructions that the recipient should never know where hope came from. Coraline had her suspicions, but some gifts were too precious to question. Tia Cora! Sophie burst through the door after school, her new sneakers squeaking against the polished floors. Mrs. Peterson says my story about the sad prince was the best in class. Coraline's heart clenched. Even now, 6 months after walking away from LACHLAN and his world of marble and mirrors, Sophie still drew pictures of the prince, who disappeared from their lives as suddenly as he'd appeared. The merger had gone through. According to the business pages Ruby read religiously, Devereaux Holdings had expanded internationally, making LACHLAN even richer and presumably even more unreachable. The bell above the door chimed, and Coraline looked up from the cupcakes she was decorating to see a figure that made her heart stop. LACHLAN stood in her doorway looking nothing like the polished CEO she remembered. His hair was longer, slightly mussed. He wore jeans, actual jeans, and a simple sweater that made his eyes look impossibly blue. He looked younger, softer, more human. "We're closed," she managed, though her voice came out barely above a whisper. "I know." He stepped inside, his gaze taking in the warm yellow walls covered with Sophie's drawings, the mismatched furniture they'd bought from estate sales, the life she'd built from scratch. "I've been watching from across the street for an hour, working up the courage to come in." "Watching again?" There was hurt in her voice, but something else too, a flutter of hope she'd tried to bury. "This time it's different." He pulled an envelope from his pocket, thick, legal-looking. "This is the deed to this building, and the one next door, and the 3-bedroom house on Maple Street with the big backyard Sophie drew pictures of." Coraline's hands trembled as she set down her piping bag. "LACHLAN, I can't. There are no strings attached." He placed the envelope on the counter between them like an offering. "No contracts, no expectations. They're yours regardless of what happens in the next 5 minutes." Emma had stopped typing. Sophie stood frozen in the doorway to the kitchen, her green eyes wide with recognition. "What happens in the next 5 minutes?" Coraline's voice was barely audible. "In the next 5 minutes, I tell you that I've spent every day for 6 months learning how to be the kind of man who deserves someone like you." He stepped closer, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been in therapy. I visit Catherine's grave not to punish myself but to say goodbye. I've learned to cook, badly, and I've read every book on your sister's poetry shelf. You read Emma's poems. I had to understand where you came from, what shaped the woman brave enough to save a broken man she barely knew." His eyes never left hers. "I sold the penthouse. I work 8-hour days now instead of 18. I have a cat. Despite everything," Coraline almost smiled. "A cat?" "A very demanding orange tabby named Biscuit who apparently belonged to the previous owner of my new apartment. She came with the place and I couldn't bring myself to—" He trailed off, looking almost embarrassed. "I couldn't abandon her. The scary prince got a kitty." Sophie's voice broke the tension, filled with pure delight. LACHLAN turned to Sophie with a smile that transformed his entire face. "Hello, Sophie. I was hoping you might want to meet her sometime. Is this the part where you kiss Tia Cora and we all live happily ever after?" Emma laughed, a sound like silver bells. "Sophie, subtle as always." LACHLAN looked back at Coraline, his expression serious again. "That depends on your aunt. I can't promise happily ever after, but I can promise that every day I'll choose to love you, choose to be worthy of the gift you are." Coraline looked around her cafe, at Emma healthy and whole, at Sophie beaming with 6-year-old wisdom, at the life she'd built with courage and hope and love. Then she looked at the man who'd first seen her as a contract, and then learned to see her as everything. "No more contracts?" she asked softly. "No more contracts," he promised. "Just truth, just love, just whatever we choose to build together." She reached across the counter and took his hand. No longer the desperate grip of a woman drowning, but the confident clasp of someone who'd learned she was worth choosing. "Then yes," she whispered. "Yes to all of it." When he kissed her, it tasted like cinnamon and second chances, like dreams fulfilled and new ones just beginning. And somewhere in the background, Sophie cheered while Emma applauded, and the sound of their joy filled every corner of the little cafe where love had finally learned to call home. 2 years later, the garden behind their Maple Street house was everything Sophie had drawn in her pictures and more. Fairy lights twinkled between the maple trees, casting golden shadows over the dozens of friends and family gathered for what Ruby insisted on calling the wedding of the century, Cedar Falls edition. Coraline stood at the kitchen window watching LACHLAN chase 7-year-old Sophie around the yard, while Biscuit supervised from her perch on the garden fence. He wore a simple navy suit, no designer labels, no price tags that could feed a family for months. Just a man who'd learned that true wealth was measured in laughter and lazy Sunday mornings. "Second thoughts?" Emma appeared beside her, radiant in the soft blue bridesmaid dress they'd found at a boutique that specialized in real people prices. Her latest poetry collection, Letters to Tomorrow, sat on bestseller lists, but she still helped at the cafe every morning, claiming the smell of coffee was better than any inspiration. About marrying him? Never. Coraline smoothed her dress, ivory lace from a local seamstress, simple and perfect. About whether I deserve this much happiness every day. You know what I think? Emma linked their arms the way they used to as children. I think happiness isn't something you earn. It's something you choose to accept when it shows up wearing a fancy suit and carrying a ridiculous contract. Through the window, they watched Marcus Chen attempt to teach Victoria Harrington how to play cornhole while Ruby directed the catering with military precision. The older woman had become an unexpected friend after the merger succeeded beyond anyone's dreams, often driving up from Manhattan just to argue politics with Emma and steal Ruby's brownie recipes. 5 minutes, ladies, Ruby called from the garden. And Coraline, stop hiding in there. This is your day to shine. LACHLAN looked up from where he was helping Sophie arrange flower petals along the makeshift aisle. Their eyes met through the glass and he smiled. Not the careful, controlled expression she'd first known, but something warm and unguarded that still made her heart skip. He'd kept every promise he'd made in the cafe that day. Therapy sessions that helped him understand the difference between love and loss. Regular dinners with friends who knew him as more than just a bank account. Quiet evenings reading to Sophie while Coraline and Emma worked on their respective dreams, hers expanding to 3 locations, Emma's reaching readers across the country. Ready? Emma asked softly. Coraline nodded, but as they headed toward the door, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Saw the announcement in the Times. Congratulations on winning the game. JM. She deleted it without a second thought. Some games weren't worth playing and some people weren't worth remembering. The ceremony itself was everything they'd wanted. Small, intimate, real. Sophie served as flower girl and ring bearer, dramatically announcing each step of her duties to the assembled crowd. Marcus delivered a best man speech that had everyone simultaneously laughing and crying. Emma read an original poem about love that grows in unexpected soil. But the moment that mattered most came during their vows when LACHLAN took her hands and spoke words that weren't written in any contract. Coraline, you taught me that love isn't something you hire or buy or negotiate. It's something you choose every morning when you wake up next to someone who makes you want to be better than you were yesterday. You chose to save me before I even knew I needed saving. Now I choose you every day for all the days we have left. When she promised to love him through rich and poor, through triumph and disaster, through his terrible attempts at pancakes and his surprisingly good cat parenting skills, even Victoria wiped away tears. As the sun set over their garden, their home, their life, their choice, Coraline danced with her husband while Sophie and Biscuit plotted mischief near the dessert table. Emma photographed everything with the vintage camera LACHLAN had given her for her last birthday, capturing moments that would become memories, memories that would become the foundation of their forever. Any regrets? LACHLAN whispered against her ear as they swayed to music, played by a local quartet instead of a symphony orchestra. Coraline looked around at the faces of everyone who mattered. Ruby arguing with the caterer, Marcus teaching Sophie card tricks, Emma deep in conversation with Victoria about the ethics of wealth distribution, their neighbors from 3 houses down, dancing badly, but enthusiastically. Just one, she said, smiling up at him. I wish I'd spilled coffee on you sooner. His laughter joined hers, carrying across the garden and up into the Vermont sky, where stars were beginning to appear like promises of all the tomorrows waiting to be written. Question for you. If a mysterious stranger offered you $75,000 to pretend to be his fiancé for 1 week, would you accept? Picture this. Your family is desperate, medical bills are piling up, and a millionaire CEO appears with a proposal that seems like the solution to all your problems, but could also be the biggest trap of your life. What would weigh most in your decision? The desperation to save someone you love, the fear of getting involved with a dangerously attractive man, the intuition that he was hiding dark secrets, the chance to experience a world that was never yours, and most importantly, do you believe it's possible to truly fall in love with someone who hired you? Where does fantasy end and real love begin? Tell us in the comments. Would you have signed that contract? What would you have done differently in Coraline's situation? Which moment in the story touched your heart the most? Your participation in our channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments.